So that's the kind of people that we're working with, and that they are making, millions and millions. And yet still there is this hunger for additional wealth that the Saudi government is extremely willing to prey on. For these people, money is all that talks. And so it's working.
Hello and welcome to Tech Won't Save Us, made in partnership with The Nation magazine. I'm your host, Marx, and this week my guest is Nathan Grayson. Nathan is a co-founder of Aftermath, a great video games and culture news website, and is the author of Stream Big, The Triumphs and Turmoils of Twitch and the Stars Behind the Screen. Now, if you're a regular listener of the show, you might remember that Nathan was on the show rather recently, a few months ago, where we talked about Microsoft and what has been happening with that company and its video games division in particular. But after the recent acquisition or, the planned acquisition of Electronic Arts, a major video games publisher, by Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund and some other investors, I thought we need to talk about this because to me, this seemed like a huge deal. Having Saudi Arabia, through its Public Investment Fund, basically move in by this massive video games company, that's huge for culture, for the video games industry itself. And, a lot of people do play video games at the end of the day. And seeing this reprehensible country's growing influence in video games, not to mention many other forms of entertainment and culture, as we talk about in this episode, it's really worrying to see that, right? Obviously Saudi Arabia has a lot of oil money. It's trying to diversify its economy and its investments because it recognizes that at some point, hopefully we would assume because of climate change, oil and gas is going to have to get phased out and it's going to make a lot less money from that, it's trying to make sure that its money is in many different places, but it also has this terrible reputation to try to clean up. And entertainment and media is a great place to try to do that through, as we have successfully seen it doing now for a number of years. And this just seems like an extension of what has been going on there. But it also signals quite a bit about the video games industry itself, where it finds itself, what these companies are doing at this moment, and, the difficulties that they face moving forward, especially because of the business decisions that companies like Electronic Arts are making that are eroding the ability to churn out interesting new experiences in favor of what is going to make the most money in the shortest amount of time. So basically what I'm saying is, there are many reasons for us to have this conversation, and I think it's a really interesting one that I hope you're going to enjoy. And then, of course, part of my motivation for having Nathan on now as well is that Aftermath, the video game website that he co-founded, is basically doing a 2-year relaunch this week. And I wanted to make sure that you knew about that and so that you could go over and check it out and see what they're up to, because I think that they're doing some really cool work over there. And that if you're a listener to the show, you might enjoy what they are doing as well. So with that said, I hope you enjoy this week's episode. If you do, make sure to leave a 5-star review on your podcast platform of choice. You can share the show on social media or with any friends or colleagues who you think would learn from it. And if you do want to support the work that goes into making Tech Won't Save Us every single week, so I can keep having these critical, in-depth conversations exploring many different aspects of the tech industry and, of course, occasionally the video games industry and beyond, including by getting ad-free episodes and stickers if you support at a certain level. You can join supporters like Brian in Inglewood, California, Heather from Traverse City, Michigan, Andrew in Montreal, and Jonathan in Melbourne, Australia, by going to patreon.com/techwon'tsavus, where you can become a supporter. Thanks so much and enjoy this week's conversation. Nathan, welcome back to Tech Won't Save Us.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Great to have you back on the show. You were on the show not too long ago, I feel like maybe a few months ago, to talk about what was going on with Microsoft, things going on in the games industry. But, there are always big developments here. And I feel like one of the things that a lot of people, even if they don't pay too much attention to games, probably picked up on recently was this massive acquisition by Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund, along with some other investors that include Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, or some firm that he's associated with, to basically buy this massive video games company, Electronic Arts. What is going on there? How did something like that come about?
Basically, what's been happening in the past handful of years is the Saudi government has become extremely involved in video games as part of a broader effort that I think a lot of people have termed sports washing, which, began obviously more in the sports world with the Saudi government investing in or buying up large swaths of many different sports, which include everything from golf to even, if you consider it a sport, like the WWE, which is pro wrestling, in an effort to kind of launder their reputation. The Saudi government has numerous human rights abuses basically working against it. And so the idea here is, okay, well, let's take a bunch of properties and things that people know, and sort of put our money behind them so that people instead associate us with that, as opposed to, for example, extrajudicial killings, the murder of a journalist, all of these sorts of things that have happened even in the recent past. And so what's happening with EA is an extension of what they were already doing with other video game properties, where basically, the Saudi government, through their public investment fund and through an arm called Savvy Games, has done a lot within the world of esports. They have something called the Esports World Cup that happens in Riyadh every year, where they both have people compete in various games, teams win millions of dollars and so on. And they also host like a conference there too that attracts a bunch of big names in the video game world. This year, their keynote speaker was Hideo Kojima, creator of Metal Gear Solid and Death Stranding. So they've been building to something like this for a while. They also have investments in companies like, I believe, Ubisoft. But this is far and away their biggest move in this area, because they are part of now a consortium that includes, as you said, Jared Kushner's investment firm, but also like their own, again, the Saudi government, to buy Electronic Arts for $55 billion, which immediately makes it like the second biggest video game company purchase ever behind Microsoft buying Activision Blizzard for $78 billion. And yeah, I mean, it seems like this is another instance of them saying, yeah, we want to move further into this entertainment medium where we've had a degree of success and influence people.
Yeah, and we know how well those massive acquisitions tend to pay off, right? As we've seen with Microsoft and as we talked about before. And we'll pick up on a bit of that again later in this conversation. But before we kind of dig into the deal a bit further, you mentioned how Saudi Arabia has been basically buying its way into all of these different, whether it's games, whether it's sports and what have you. I'm assuming, I haven't looked it up, but I'm assuming that really picks up after the reputational damage of butchering a journalist, Jamal Khashoggi, and how all of these governments, all of these companies didn't want to work with Saudi Arabia afterward. And I would have to imagine that all of their spending really ramps up after that. Would that be a good guess?
Yeah, I mean, the major sports washing effort has come, in the past half decade or so, where it's grown from, poking at the edges of something to a concerted effort where you can see them buying into all of these different sports and industries. Others that I didn't even mention, boxing has been a huge one for them. They basically transformed that entire sport, at least in terms of paying big names to fight each other, which, to wit, this approach works, right? In that if you use boxing, and now to a lesser extent MMA as an example, fans have an often favorable view of Saudi Arabia and its crown prince because, the things that they wanted to happen, Saudi money has made happen. All the big names who were for years hesitant to fight each other ended up fighting because the purse was big enough. And so similarly, I think that, we've seen this in esports as well. The Esports World Cup initially was kind of derided, and a lot of people were hesitant to participate in it because of Saudi Arabia's reputation. But the amount of money that you could win kept getting bigger, and it stuck around. And so then this year, because I've been doing some reporting on this, or at least, trying to poke at the edges of kind of finding out how much the Saudi government is paying people in esports, how much it's paying, various content creators to kind of stream their events and, again, publicize them. And one person I talked to who's a major esports commentator said, okay, well, last year even, a lot of other people in my field were kind of holdouts. They're like, I'm not going to do it. The money's not good enough. And also ethically, it just feels bad. My audience would be upset with me, so on and so forth. And so this esports commentator is this year that number has fallen tremendously, and everyone's just kind of accepting it and going along with it. And it's not even that much money, but it's enough that they're yeah, we're going to do it. Especially because, and this is the other thing that the Saudi government has been good at least in games, esports is a flailing industry. Esports has spent its entire existence as an industry kind of jumping from means of getting cash injections to means of getting cash injections. And when one runs out, they find another. And this time they found the Saudi government, which again is artificially inflating, the overall value of esports as an industry. And so, they're good at preying on desperation. Similarly, video games in general, game development right now is in a really tough spot. Companies have been laying off a lot of people. They've been trying to present the illusion of infinite growth while also coping with the fact that the industry is changing, that the extent to which people are willing to spend money on games is changing, how they want to spend money on games is changing. And so, yeah, a company like EA was, I'm sure, extremely happy to be like, okay, yeah, let's get out of the public sector for now. Let's go private. And let's also make sure that we have, at least for the moment, plentiful money on hand. Now, the terms of that deal are something entirely different, where basically in 2027, they'll be saddled with $20 billion in debt. So, EA is not going to have a lot of money for long, but you can see how that would be tempting to, at the very least, executives and the board.
Absolutely. Anytime there's these numbers like this, the board and the investors are going to be interested because they get their payback and whatnot. Even when you're talking about the esports commentators and like the money that they're taking, and I can definitely see how this kind of relates to some of the work that you've been doing, like your book, Stream Big, that looks at, the streaming industry and things like that, which is a really good insight into that whole world. But when you're talking about the money that can be available for these folks to get them to kind of not look so much at the human rights violations and the treatment of women and all that kind of stuff, and just take the money, like it brings to mind the big controversy that we saw just recently that, really broke into like the mainstream, where you had all these comedians going over to participate in this comedy festival, and they were all basically being attacked for doing it. But they were like, the money is good enough that I'm just going to look the other way and go get the bag and then come back, right?
Yeah, and that part is wild too, because, these were all big name comedians. It's not like these were small timers who are, struggling to pull themselves up by their bootstraps or whatever. These were people like Dave Chappelle and Aziz Ansari, these like almost household names. I mean, Pete Davidson, obviously, people like that. And yet they were still like, yeah, we're going to go over here and potentially compromise our values just for like this big paycheck, which I think also speaks to like, how this works now. Because similarly, like the people on EA's board, EA's executives, especially like Andrew Wilson, who's their CEO, who's like pay, at least for the moment, is public, and who makes tens of millions. In fact, I think that, yeah, EA had to rein in the amount that he was making at one point because it was getting a little bit ridiculous. So I did a piece recently on how much he made in 2024 after EA laid off a bunch of people. Let's see. Yeah, during fiscal 2024, Wilson took home over $25.6 million via a mixture of a $1.3 million base salary, $20.4 million in stock awards, $3.44 million from a non-equity incentive plan, and around $500,000 in personal security benefits. So that's the kind of people that we're working with, and that they are making, millions and millions hand over fist every year, probably in billionaire territory, if not high hundred millionaire. And yet still, there is this hunger for additional wealth that the Saudi government is extremely willing to prey on. For these people, money is all that talks. And so it's working.
I don't know, man. I would have a hard time getting by on $20 million. I don't know about you. That'd be so tough for me.
Yeah, no, I mean, at that rate, I could barely afford like 2 or 3 super yachts.
But, speaking about EA, right? For me, I feel like this is a company that I associate with like being younger, and they made like a load of different games, and I was like really interested in what they were doing, and they had a bunch of different studios that were like churning out different things, and it feels like it has evolved so much over the past number of years that like what it makes has become very limited. A lot of the different things it used to experiment with, I feel like we don't see anymore. And it seems like it's focused on like a few big brands, particularly in sports, but some games beyond that as well. And it really feels like there's a dearth of like other types of games and things like that as well. Like, what happened to this company? Like, how has it evolved over the past while to get to this point?
To understand EA, you've got to just understand that, yeah, it has some of the biggest sports series ever under its belt. And that, like, if you look at regular video game sales charts, they're just perennial top contenders. They're always just sort of up there being the best sellers. And those are like FIFA and Madden. And so after a while, EA realized, okay, these are our dependable cash cows, and we should load them down with like microtransactions that keep people invested in spending more and more money on these games every year. And so we just like milk that, and that's how we stay afloat. That's how we stay solvent. And then everything else is kind of, an attempt to fit other series into that particular mold, to create these like mega games that stick around forever, which in some ways is also a microcosm of the games industry at large. games as a service has taken over at least the kind of like MBA executive brained side of things. Everybody wants to have the next big service game. Everybody wants to be the next League of Legends or the next Fortnite or the next Grand Theft Auto or whatever, where instead of you selling a box product every year, you just have a game that goes on and on and on forever, and people spend a bunch of money within that ecosystem, well over $60 per person. But I think from EA's side, it's a little bit different because they do like to iterate every year on their sports game series. They just also have now packed it full of, various little things you can buy and like ultimate team modes where you can participate and have an incentive to spend more money over time. And so, yeah, that's fundamentally transformed the company into one that produces a pretty limited series of games and that is not willing to take risks anymore to really any extent. They've had, in addition to all of that, some pretty high profile flops in the recent past. Dragon Age, that game actually is a perfect kind of encapsulation of all of this in that, so Dragon Age is a fantasy role-playing game. Previous entries have been lauded for their story and for their characters and for creating immersive worlds that players like to go to and experience largely on their own and on their own terms. So the most recent Dragon Age, the Veilguard, went through multiple iterations in development and actually began as a kind of multiplayer game, which was already a weird decision on EA's part, considering the series past. But again, they wanted it to fit this mold. And so then it went through multiple iterations over the course of development. And they, after a certain point, were like, okay, we got to ship this. We got to get something out there. Let's take kind of all these assets we have and all these things that we've put together, all these various systems, and make a more classic, or at least try to make a more classic Dragon Age with them, because what we were doing before just isn't working. It's not producing a game that people enjoy. And, we've been at this for, by the time the game came out, nearly a decade. They want a particular thing, but it doesn't actually necessarily apply to all their series. And then when they release something as a result of these competing visions, that game is compromised and people don't like it. It doesn't sell well. And then, of course, as a result of that, they lay a bunch of people off. That is the pattern. It's also worth noting that given how sports-centric EA has become, at least in terms of its overall economic approach, that it makes a lot of sense that the Saudi government would want to buy them in particular, because the Saudi government is so invested in sports washing. One of the only sports that the Saudi government has not really succeeded at breaking into, at least in some capacity, or at least in a significant capacity, is the NFL. What is a good way to build connections in the world of the NFL? To own the big NFL video game. That's what I've heard from like some people, and I think it's mostly speculation, but there's this notion that buying EA may not even be like a major play in the world of video games. Like, it's a happy byproduct, but their actual goal might be to make it into the NFL, because the NFL is like, A, it's the biggest sport in America. B, it's like a cash cow of cash cows. That's the sport that commands the most money for TV rights. That's, if they could break in over there and become a mover and shaker in that world, then that's it. To borrow a football term, game, set, and mash.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense, right? Like, even when you were talking about Andrew Wilson and like the fact that EA had all these sports franchises, I was like making the connection in my head that I was like, oh man, it makes perfect sense for them to buy EA if like they're already doing all this sports washing to get all the big sports games, right? You have some like 2K sports games and things like that, but like EA has some of the major ones. And even when you talk about Dragon Age Veilguard, like for me, one of the things that I loved about EA was the BioWare games, which Dragon Age is part of, right? And I played Veilguard as well, and it was boring, like, unfortunately, and I was really disappointed by it. And so, like, you can see how this kind of transformation from being able to make it these single player games that are great experiences that, make enough money to make it worthwhile, to now being like, okay, we need to make so much money because there are these massive, as you're saying, kind of like always on kind of service games, which the sports games fit into, but there are other things there as well that EA is making their money off of, that it's like, if it's not one of those that are making these like blockbuster numbers, then it's really not just going to make sense anymore. And like, it feels so disappointing because it's not just an EA problem. I feel like this is something that we see across so much of like the video game industry now, where the kind of type of games that get made is increasingly limited, especially if you're looking at like the AAA space. And it's like, you need to kind of look at the more indie space if you're looking for anything beyond those kind of massive open world service games, things like that, right?
Absolutely. And even then, like, The indie space is fraught in its own way, in that I think, at this point, it's impossible to say if a game is going to hit it big or not. If only because so many games come out every day. They're all competing for a lot of the same real estate on Steam. And so, like, for a while, conventional wisdom was, well, there are just too many games and a lot of them are garbage. And so you're going to get drowned out by pure noise. But now, like, Steam is optimized to kind of push those games down so people don't really see them. It's algorithmically driven like anything else. And so the bigger problem is that if you're an indie, you're competing with all of the good stuff, both the good stuff that is also indie and a bunch of AAA games that, take up prominent space on the service. And so, like, some indie games break through, but a lot of them don't. And that means that there's a contraction happening in that side of the industry too. So, like, it's hard because in terms of the games that are coming out, there's some really, really amazing stuff. But even as it's a golden age for kind of like game quality and to an extent creativity, like, it's not sustainable. All of this is untenable. And like, in the next handful of years, especially, I think we're going to see the impacts of that.
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense, unfortunately. And so if we look at a company like EA, then this big deal happens now where it looks like they're going to be acquired by Saudi Arabia's public investment fund, along with these other investors, as you were saying. What does that mean for the company itself then moving forward? Like, will it still have the same degree of control over what it makes? Will it potentially change what it makes? Like, what does it mean company-wise? Do we have an idea of that?
I mean, all we know right now is what EA has said. And of course, companies can say anything in a situation like this. In fact, they love to, because they want the merger to go through, because they stand to benefit from that. And so, like, right now, they're in that spot where there are fewer than you would hope entities in and around the government and places like that calling for regulatory scrutiny of this acquisition for totally understandable reasons. As we've discussed, it's pretty clear what the Saudi government is trying to do here. So immediately following the acquisition, so U.S. Senators Elizabeth Warren and Richard Blumenthal sent letters to the U.S. Treasury Secretary and Committee of Foreign Investment Chair Scott Bensent and Electronic Arts CEO Andrew Wilson, basically saying, like, hey, this needs to be observed more closely. And, risks here include, and this is their quote, surveillance of Americans, covert Saudi propaganda, and selective retaliation and censorship of persons disfavored by the Saudi government. CWA, which is a union that has helped organize a lot of the video game industry, calling for regulatory scrutiny here. Of course, EA is going to say, don't worry, nothing to be concerned about. This is all going to be business as usual. And so in a recent updated kind of FAQ aimed at workers and employees, they said, we will continue to be guided by our cultural values of creativity, pioneering, passion, determination, learning, and teamwork. A lot of words that don't mean anything. But anyway, back to the quote. EA will maintain creative control, and our track record of creative freedom and player-first values will remain intact. But of course, like, what does that mean? And, in this same FAQ, they say, like, our headquarters is going to remain where it is already. We're going to continue using AI and things like that in the same ways. It basically, every single response to any conceivable question is met with, nothing's going to change. There aren't going to be layoffs in the immediate future. That's hilarious, considering that they're about to be saddled with $20 billion in debt. Like, there's going to be hell layoffs at some point. They like, I think they use the term like immediate future. So it's like, yeah, that's doing a lot of heavy lifting, right? But yeah, so they're trying to drive home this message. But in terms of actually retaining creative control, like, no, they're about to have new management. That's not how that works. And we've already seen that, like, the Saudi government likes to have control in these situations, or likes to, to get a return on its investment, at least in terms of influence, if not in terms of profit. Even recently, so like in collaboration with Ubisoft, which again, they also have a stake in, or let's see, I think they have a stake in it. And basically, it's been reported that the Saudi government covertly funded new DLC for an Assassin's Creed game. And it's basically set in like a portion of the country that they want to, present as a great place for tourism. And like, that is a very overt instance of them being like, this is what we would like, exerting influence via money. The other big example is that they had struck a deal with the International Olympic Committee, the Saudi government had, to create the Esports Olympic Games. And that was going to be like a decade-long deal. But at the 11th hour, the two sides failed to see side to side on the creation of like an overseeing federation because their federation's involved with like each individual sport in the Olympics. And so the Saudi government was like, okay, the ones that we're looking at that are in esports, they're not like profitable, so we don't trust them. Let's not go with that. And so what they proposed instead, and again, this is like very notable considering everything else that we've heard about, like control and creative control. What they proposed would have been under Saudi control in perpetuity. And of course, the Olympic Committee was like, no, we don't want to do that. That sounds terrible. There's a report on all of this from the Esports Advocate. And in that, they also ended on the quote, further, the Saudi contingent pushed back on being forced to put women in leadership positions and adhering to rules on who and what nations it could or could not allow to participate. That sounds like a lot of very discrete control with like extremely specific goals in mind. And so for EA to come along and be like, don't worry, those same guys aren't going to meddle with us, is like, yeah, they're not going to meddle with the studio that like has tons of queer options in Dragon Age games, that like produces The Sims, which is one of the original series. Like The Sims was pioneering back in the day in terms of inclusiveness where queer and gay characters are regarded. Like that was one of the first games to ever just be like, here it is. And so like, yeah, you think that the Saudi government's going to be like, don't worry about it. We'll let that sail right on through. You know, you got to be kidding yourself.
Absolutely. It's really hard to see them not kind of stepping in on some of these things, especially after like the acquisition period is over, right? Because we see, as you're saying, so often that these companies talk a great game in the moment where the deal needs to be approved and things are still kind of working out. And then within the couple of years after that, it's like, okay, everything changes and it's not really aligned with what they said anyway. But I did want to pick up on what you were saying there about the Saudi government being invested in not just like the video games industry, not just esports, but this kind of like broader sports industry in general. And as you were saying there, it's looking for profit, it's looking for influence. But do we see that these things actually make a difference? Like, do we see the strategy being successful with Saudi Arabia being able to like wash its reputation through all of these acquisitions, all of this spending?
I would say so. I mean, it's like I was saying earlier, you know, at least in the places that I watch, it's working. It's been hyper normalized in boxing. The Saudi government basically just funds that sport right now. And it's only making further inroads. They recently partnered with Zuffa, which is the company that owns the UFC and that produces all of their events, to create Zuffa Boxing, which will, I mean, it's going to do a whole bunch of things that are basically terrible. I mean, it's a very complicated deal in that the Saudi side of it is going to be funding big money fights. And the side of it that's sort of run by like Dana White, the CEO of the UFC, is going to be kind of creating a more of like a feeder league where they can basically pay people pennies to get their brains beat in. They're going to structure that like the UFC, which also has horrible issues with athlete pay. But yeah, so they are getting super involved over there. Again, there's just this issue of once upon a time, especially like in sports, there was a lot of pushback. When the Saudi government first started making these inroads, there are many people saying like, no, this is wrong. We shouldn't watch these events. We shouldn't support this because it goes against our ethics and our morals. And what the Saudi government successfully did was said, okay, well, you know, we got money, we got time. We'll just weather that initial storm and you'll get used to us. And sure enough, people did. You just see, you know, if we're talking like reporting, right? Back when this first became a thing over 5 years ago, there were tons of reports. There were tons of articles about this issue, especially as it pertains to the various sports that the Saudi government was especially interested in. Now there just aren't many. I mean, unless you go to like Defector and places like that, you know, kind of take a much more like, that are much more critical of all of these things. It's just not really something that people talk about as much. It's just sort of accepted. It's like, yep, where's all the money coming from? Oh yeah, the Saudi government. Who are those guys standing in the background of whatever sport? It's, you know, the Saudis. They're attending an event that they funded. It's just kind of the status quo now.
Yeah. And, you know, when you talk about like those boxing matches and the esports competitions and things like that, like one thing I've noticed is a lot more conferences like happening in Saudi Arabia as well, which I'm sure, you know, there must be some sort of like incentive or funding or something like that to kind of get them to locate there, to have their conferences in Riyadh or wherever else. But like a lot of these sports and these events, then would they be like holding competitions, matches like in Saudi Arabia itself? Like, I guess when we're talking about esports as well.
In a lot of cases, yes. So it depends on the sport and the time of year. A lot of these sports, are international. So they have like one major event in Saudi Arabia or a couple. But also, like a lot of those big boxing fights I was talking about, yeah, they took place in Saudi Arabia. Even some of them in ways that like hurt them, right? At least in terms of their ability to make money via more traditional means. Yeah, I believe this is what happened. The big boxing match between Tyson Fury and Francis Ngannou, who's a former UFC champion, that I believe was held in Riyadh or a major Saudi Arabian city. So it had to occur like, super early in the morning for people in the West. It did not sell well. The pay-per-view didn't sell well at all. There have been debates over whether that was because Ngannou's not a draw, but whatever. It didn't sell well, but they still did it that way because, they're like, we're going to have it in our country because we paid for it. So there are a lot of things like that. But then other sports are like, okay, we're going to have like our tentpole event in Riyadh or in a surrounding area. That's what the WWE does now. The Esports World Cup is similar. The major matches of that event are held, I believe, in or around Riyadh. And then also more recently, in the past few years, there's been the new Global Sport Conference, which takes place alongside the Esports World Cup. And that's, again, that event where a bunch of like really high profile video game executives and investors and founders and other types kind of meet and basically give a series of talks. I mean, what it really is like a networking event for very wealthy and powerful people in the games industry. But, if you can facilitate, even through just presence, kind of like big deals in the games industry, if you can be around those, then like you have this other kind of means, I guess, of getting in on the ground floor, I guess, of a lot of important things that are happening in the industry, especially right now. Like, given that there's a dearth of investment in video games, and you say, okay, we put together this conference where a bunch of rich people are going to hobnob with video game executives. It's like, again, you'd be a fool not to go to that if you were a video game CEO.
We talked earlier about like the recent controversy around all of the comedians going over to Saudi Arabia and how like a lot of them were pushed on human rights things and like why they were taking this money to go do it. Do we see that in like sports and video games and stuff anymore? Or has that really just fallen off because the money has become so common and, almost expected at this point?
Yeah. Again, it's definitely fallen off. I think there's still some dissent in video games, although it depends on where you look. I think that, for example, the fighting game community was a locus of dissent for a long time because fighting games have an especially kind of like diverse user base or player base. They have a very like grassroots scene. And so as a result, there are a lot more people of color, a lot more queer people who play fighting games. But the Saudi government has just bought their way in. They bought the biggest fighting game tournament, Evo. They bought their way into kind of the entire Street Fighter, just like professional progression. And so people have gotten more and more used to it. There was an instance earlier this year where basically the community around a game called GeoGuessr, which is this sort of like Google Maps game where you're presented with like a random location and you have to guess on a map in the world where it is, which is like a crazy skill that people have cultivated. There's some people who you can just show them anything and they'll just be like, it's there in a heartbeat. It's actually wild, but it has a kind of nascent esports scene. And so the company behind it said, yeah, we're going to be part of the Esports World Cup. And the community there, which again is generally very diverse and progressive, was like, no, you are not. And so they openly rebelled. And basically like the quote unquote maps in this game, so like the kind of like series of things that you have to guess, a lot of those maps are created by community members. They also have the power to remove those things. In reaction to this company saying, yeah, we're going to go be part of the Esports World Cup, we're going to like have an official presence there with our game, the community map makers who make things for GeoGuessr, often in their spare time, just because it's for the love of the game, did a quote unquote blackout where they basically removed like hundreds of the most prominent and important maps that people use to play the game and to compete in the game. And so suddenly there was just like a lack of content in the game, at least in terms of the most important stuff. And eventually the company relented and they're like, never mind, we're not going to do it. We hear you loud and clear because we don't really have a choice. This is an interesting instance of how this can play out because effectively what you have is the players controlling the means of production. And so they just did what you would normally do if we had a functioning society, which is slam on the brakes and say, no, we won't let the powers that be do this because we don't approve. Whereas for other games and other series, that's just not the case. Companies are proprietary, they control it all. And so there's just not a good way for communities and players to say, hey, we disapprove and we want you to reevaluate.
That's really awesome. I hadn't heard about that story. That's really cool. When we're talking about what the Saudi Arabian government is doing, obviously EA is a big focus right now, but you mentioned that they have investments in a lot of other different parts of the video games industry. Can you talk a bit about that, like their ongoing efforts and like what they have already been up to in seeding money throughout this industry to try to gain influence and to try to gain stakes in so many different like video game companies?
Here's a really useful article from Game Developer, which is a great site. They're kind of true to their name. They're sort of more focused on like content for developers or, about the industry. But they have an article that is titled, All the Gaming Companies Saudi Arabia Owns or Has Invested in. EA is the obvious one. Scopely, that's right, Monopoly Go creator Scopely, who they bought in 2023 for $4.9 billion, which is definitely not anything to sneeze at. And then Scopely, while being part of a game company that is owned by the Saudi government called Saudi Games, they then bought out the developer Pokemon Go, Niantic, for $3.5 billion. So basically the Saudi government owns like Pokemon Go, which is a huge game. Let's see, SNK, that's a fighting game company. Oh yeah, that's another instance where they've exerted control. They like put a DJ that the Saudi government likes into a fighting game. Oh yeah, well, they own a 96% stake in SNK. So they just own that company. Yeah, how Saudi funds bought Cristiano Ronaldo into a fighting game. Yeah, who's of course a major soccer star.
And who is at one of the teams that's now owned by the Saudi government, right?
Right. And so they put him into a fighting game that is made up of fictional characters. And they also then added Salvatore Ganacci, a Bosnian Swedish DJ, to this series that had previously not had anything of the sort. So isn't that fun? The Public Investment Fund owns roughly 5% of Nintendo. Oh, and then they became the Japanese company's biggest outside stakeholder in 2023 with an 8.26% investment. So, think about that next time you're playing games on the Switch 2, I guess. Take-Two, which is the publisher of Grand Theft Auto, they own 3.5% of that. Activision Blizzard, which is obviously now owned entirely by Microsoft, but in 2021 they owned 2% of that company. Let's see, Capcom, which again publishes a lot of fighting, or publishes Street Fighter, other major fighting games, but also Monster Hunter, Resident Evil, a bunch of series people really like. 5% there. Nexon, 5%. Embracer, this was a big one because Embracer was like this, or still is technically like a major kind of video game publishing umbrella. They bought up a ton of different studios. They had bought all these game companies, spent tons of money, and then the plan was for Saudi Arabia to come through with a $2 billion deal that, would have kept that operation afloat. And then the Saudi government backed out and Embracer collapsed, basically, and had to lay off tons of people, sell tons of studios, cancel tons of games. It was sort of the canary in the coal mine of the current moment in the games industry, of all these layoffs and all this talent suddenly being without a job, leading to other people also not being able to get jobs and everything. And then, we have other things like the Esports World Cup, which I already talked about. But so they have invested in all of these different companies to varying degrees. With the Embracer deal, they were, set to like really take over a sector of the industry, but decided that that was not how they're going to approach things anymore. And that had catastrophic results. Yeah, they've been doing this for a minute. I think that initially they were sort of poking and prodding to see what would happen. And through that, they came up with a plan to say, okay, well, we're just going to buy up an entire major publisher and make that our own.
Which is still wild to see, but you mentioned Embracer, which was kind of seemed like almost this like financial play, right? Especially in the early 2020s when it was buying up all of these studios and properties to get more things like under its umbrella. And the question was like, how is this even going to work? And then of course, it all fell apart as people might expect. But it also owns the Lord of the Rings IP, or like not wholly, but like it owns part of. I don't know. There are certain aspects of it that it owns, right? And still retains, even though it sold off a bunch of other things. But embrace or looking at it as like this financial play, right? To get all these video game companies under one roof and to try to make money out of that. It brings me back to what you were saying about EA and how this deal is structured as like a leverage buyout, right? So basically, these companies, the Saudi Public Investment Fund, Kushner's firm, Silver Lake Investment, they are basically borrowing money against EA's own assets and then using that money in order to fund the purchase. And like you said, that means that something like $20 billion of debt is going to be put on the balance sheet. That obviously can't be good for a video games company that presumably needs to turn a profit, but like needs to make money for investors at the end of the day. If you have $20 billion of new debt all of a sudden sitting on the balance sheet, you're going to have to make some pretty drastic decisions in order to like pay that back or something, right?
Yeah. I mean, almost certainly. And, the playbook, at least in terms of what in video games right now, the kind of, meta, to use a video game term, even for companies that are profitable, that are reporting like, record profits, because again, the name of the game is no longer just being profitable, it's growth. You've got to be showing better and better profit percentage wise every year or every fiscal quarter. And so it's already layoffs. A lot of companies, including, we were talking about Microsoft earlier, which is another company that has bought up large swaths of the video game industry and which has reported, profit, has been like, look at us, record numbers, blah, blah, blah. Has in the past couple of years, laid off almost 4,000 people in its game sector alone across the company, way, way more than that. It doesn't take like a soothsayer or whatever to see what's coming in this case. As soon as that debt hits, they're going to be like, all right, it is time for mass layoffs. And even then, with $20 billion in debt, that's not going to correct the balance. And so I'm sure that they're going to lean into the things that they believe to be profitable, which are going to be, sports games, service games, microtransactions, means of getting people to spend money and making them feel like they need to be competitive or to fulfill whatever desire they've instilled in players within the confines of the game. I think that most people would agree that over-reliance on those sorts of features and mechanics does not lead to a good game. I think a lot of people would agree that those things even make games significantly worse, which is why there is a hunger among a lot of players, at least like longtime players of games, for, something that's less laden with those sorts of, I would say, coercive mechanics and features.
Yeah, sure. You cut your costs by getting rid of workers and the people who are making the game good in the first place. And then you also figure out ways to like extract more profit from the players themselves. Like it's not going to work out at the end of the day.
Well, and these are also like very distinctly short-term plays, right? It's not like you are saying, okay, what can we do to create something that nobody's ever seen before, something that is unique and that, audience gravitate toward on that basis of saying like, wow, yeah, this is a really innovative game. This is so interesting. I want to, explore this world, or I want to like try this new thing and be enriched by that. Instead, it is, okay, how can we like hook this into their veins such that they don't want to remove it because they are functionally addicted. And then they will spend the maximum dollar amount possible to, feel good in this, like, again, very short-term way. It's not going to be pretty.
For me, as I was reading about basically the way that was being structured, it was hard not to think about the Activision Blizzard deal, Microsoft buying that up a few years ago, and then the aftermath of what we have seen from that. And that's kind of where I wanted to like end our conversation, because last time you were on the show, we talked about Microsoft and what was going on. And I feel like one of the big stories that we've had since we had that conversation was the recent revelations that Microsoft's chief financial officer basically told the Xbox gaming division that it needed to turn 30% profit margins, and that seems to be one of the like driving reasons behind a number of decisions that have seemed to like baffle a lot of people watching the company or watching the gaming division at Microsoft over the past few years for how it's been operating. So what is going on there? What did you make of this kind of revelation? Did it put a lot of things into perspective for you?
Yeah, definitely. Because, yeah, I mean, ever since Microsoft kind of completed the Activision Blizzard transaction and acquired that series of studios, that publisher, they have been laying people off, closing studios, and canceling games. And that has obviously, like, I mean, A, that's given them a very bad reputation in the games industry. B, it's also hamstrung their own efforts to, become, I think, the dominant player in the industry, which they've never been able to do. They've been a perennial kind of second or third place, depending on how you count these things. But yeah, from a distance, you would look at them and say, like, they keep shooting themselves in the foot. Why are they doing that? And as it turns out, yeah, Microsoft has basically implemented an across the board, quote unquote, 30% accountability margin. It's a really funny nonsense word. Why not just call it a profit margin? What are we doing? But I think it's also illustrative of probably what we can come to expect from, EA post Saudi deal. Like, again, if they also have to turn this ridiculous profit to make up for the debt that they will be under, then, the playbook is probably going to be similar, which is lay people off, like I was saying earlier. And then also anything that seems like an undue risk or that seems like it's not going to pan out in this way that will be just like overwhelmingly profitable, cut it or kill it. And so that can mean a lot of years worth of work down the drain. That can mean a lot of like, unique and interesting projects, even ones that like garnered decent public support, where people saw a trailer or something and they're like, yeah, I'm excited about that. Could get canceled. For example, in Microsoft's case, they were working on a revival of this series called Perfect Dark, which was big back in the Nintendo 64 days, less big during the Xbox 360 days, but hey, they tried. And like the new game that they showed, I think during the Game Awards at one point, people were like, whoa, that looks really cool. And they still canceled that. There was also like a new MMO in development from the Elder Scrolls Online studio, which great proven track record. One of the few ongoing MMOs that continues to receive updates and is doing well. They killed that, laid off a bunch of people over there. I think that the general impression was if they just let them cook a little bit longer, then they would have had something really special in their hands. Actually, even before this year, Blizzard was working on a new game that, seemed like it really, at least internally, if you were talking to people over there, like it had the juice and they put a lot of effort into it. It was going to be like a survival game. And in that round of layoffs, I think shortly after the acquisition, that got canceled and they killed that. And this is another industry-wide problem. But if you are smothering every new idea you have in the cradle because you're not 100% certain that it's going to make millions or hundreds of millions of dollars, then eventually you're going to run out of runway. You're not going to have anything new. You're just going to have the same old stuff. And no matter how many mechanics you put in to get people addicted to your game or whatever, they will get bored and they will move on. And when you're competing not just with other video games, but also with Netflix and YouTube, and especially TikTok and Instagram, people scrolling, like you need novel things to, I guess, steal back their attention because you are losing the attention war right now. Everyone is losing the attention war to TikTok and Instagram. That's why you have Netflix talking about like second screen content, about the idea of, have your characters narrate what they're up to because people aren't really going to be watching your thing. And like video games demand often full attention. So like if you are getting rid of all of your new ideas, your best efforts in terms of kind of luring people back, then that's a dead end. At that point, you're functionally, and you can see this in some of the business decisions people are making, but like you are kind of selling the industry for parts.
I wonder what you make of like where it goes from here then, right? Because obviously Microsoft and Xbox were part of this console war with PlayStation and to a far lesser degree Nintendo because they're, just often kind of doing their own thing in their own little category. But in recent years, we have continually had these Xbox games being released on PlayStation. Most recently, the kind of updated, remastered Halo game that they are putting out was announced for PlayStation as well. Halo being like one of the defining Xbox franchises. And also this news that it looks like Xbox's next console, if we even want to call it that, is basically going to be a PC, not so much a console in the way that we would traditionally understand it. So what do you think that this means for like the future of this dynamic that we have often understood kind of the video games industry to be for the past couple decades or so, at least?
I mean, at least in terms of the way that these businesses are operating right now, the scale at which they're operating and the kind of money that they want to make, that dynamic, doesn't work anymore. The notion of like you release a kind of singular piece of hardware, all of your best stuff goes on that, like all of the big games, that's like the home for those things. That's just not going to be the case anymore, unless you're Nintendo. I think Nintendo will keep doing that for the most part because they, again, are off doing their own thing and it works for them, clearly. But yeah, Sony and Microsoft are both kind of testing the waters of, especially in Microsoft's case, being like, okay, well, now everything is an Xbox, is what they love to say at this point. And so I think they're just trying to extract as much money as possible, as much quote unquote growth as possible from what they have in kind of their like larger milieu. And a lot of that involves, okay, well, we're going to put our biggest games on every platform because that's more people can spend money on them. We're going to try to release across multiple kinds of hardware. We're going to enter the streaming world. We have Game Pass, which is a very important part of what they're doing, but it doesn't necessarily seem to be panning out in terms of profitability, at least in terms of how you'd measure profitability, which is a whole can of worms, but whatever. So yeah, they're trying all of these things to grow in that direction. But at the same time, again, they're also killing off a lot of games and studios. And there are multiple things that come of that. One is, again, that concern of, okay, well, if you keep getting rid of all these projects, then where does kind of innovation come from? Where do the games that will, hook players years from now, years down the line, where do those come from? And the other problem is just that, if you've bought up so many video game studios, which Microsoft has, because their original plan, at least insofar as people understand it, was to buy a lot of game studios so that they'd have a constant flow of content for Game Pass, which is basically their Netflix. But when you're buying all these studios and then you close them or lay people off from them, that produces larger ripple effects on the whole industry. Suddenly the industry, which you were bankrolling, is less healthy. People are jobless. People can't find other work because the job market is so crowded with really talented people. We're talking people with decades of experience who are also trying to find a new job, that just the entire thing begins to crumble. And like, as a major company, I think that if you are engaging in this kind of behavior, you have a responsibility to take care of the industry that you are part of. But evidently Microsoft does not agree.
You would imagine that would be the case, but as you're saying, I guess that's not what we see. And we see, whether it's at Microsoft or just across this industry more broadly, the effort to turn out these short-term profits at the expense of so much else, right? Regardless of where that's going to put things in the years to come, especially for people who enjoy playing games. Obviously, this is a story that's going to continue to evolve. I'm sure you'll probably be on the show again in the future, and we'll dig into other aspects of it. But another place where people can get information on this is obviously at the website that you kind of co-founded, Aftermath, where you explore all of the details of this video game news and other kind of like broader cultural news. And I know that you guys have recently kind of refreshed the website, have kind of done a relaunch. Do you want to give us an insight into what's going on there and why people should head over and check it out?
So yeah, we have been in business as a worker-owned video game website for 2 years now, which is crazy to think about because it feels like we launched yesterday, but also like we have been working there for our whole lives and then some. I think as a statement of intent, and also just because we wanted something a little bit more versatile for both readers and for ourselves, we've relaunched the site. It's shiny and new, and I think looks very nice. It's a thing where when we first launched, it's not that we cobbled something together. It's more that, we didn't know what we were doing yet. We were a bunch of journalists. We had not done anything business wise. We hadn't founded anything before. And so we just sort of took what we were given, which was great. We were working with Lead, who also powers Defector and stuff. We got a good website out of the deal, but now we know what we want and what we need. So we're like, okay, we're going to relaunch. And also just, I think that when you are kind of in this space of being a worker-owned media outlet, you kind of have to, for better and for worse, repeatedly command people's attention. It's actually sort of funny. It's like being a live service video game in a lot of ways, where you've got to say, hey, here's this big event, or here's this change, or here's this new thing. Because otherwise people drift. And if your business is primarily subscriber based, you lose people to churn. And so, there's that element as well. But more than anything else, we've been doing this as kind of our own business for a couple of years now. And we feel like we've gone from being a spirited attempt at making something different to kind of counteract what has happened to a lot of video game websites, where they have succumbed to the kind of current economic trends of the internet, which are based on a lot of clickbait, a lot of SEO optimization, mostly writing guides, not really doing investigative journalism, not really digging into anything anymore, because they just need content, content, content. Like, that's always been our mission statement, is something against that, is quality over quantity, and like just focusing on good work, much of it written, which again, the internet doesn't really prioritize these days. But we've gone from trying to do that and being like, okay, let's just like line up every possible rake that we can step on so we can just do it in order, one foot after the other, to being functional and hopefully sustainable in the longer term. But yeah, and so I think we wanted to express that. We wanted to be like, yep, we are in this for the long haul, and this model can work despite everything else happening on the internet right now, despite how many people, especially in games journalism, lose their jobs like on the daily or on the weekly. There is a way forward. We just have to all work together to build it. We plan to keep doing that.
Awesome. And I'm an Aftermath subscriber. I enjoy what you guys are doing, and people should definitely go over to aftermath.site, check out the new kind of refresh, relaunch, and, see what you guys are up to. Nathan, it's always great to have you on the show to get your insights on what's going on with this industry. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Yeah, of course. Thank you again for having me.
Nathan Grayson is a co-founder of Aftermath and the author of Stream Big. Tech Won't Save Us is made in partnership with The Nation magazine and is hosted by me, Paris Marx. Production is by Kyla Hewson. Tech Won't Save Us relies on the support of listeners like you to keep providing critical perspectives on the tech industry. You can join hundreds of other supporters by going to patreon.com/techwon'tsave us and making a pledge of your own. Thanks for listening. Make sure to come back next week.